Lanterns bloomed along the Thames like floating coins. Music leaked from taverns with a stubborn cheer of people spending tomorrow before it arrived. In the better streets, carriage wheels whispered over wet stone, and the windows of gaming houses glowed gold, drawing in anyone hungry for luck, pleasure, or a secret that could be traded for favor. A man could lose a fortune in an hour and still laugh, because laughter was cheaper than thinking about what the city was becoming. And in those warm rooms where wine ran and the cards slapped like small duels, London's real politics often happened, not in Parliament, but in the pauses between wagers. The room was built to make men forget consequence. Mirrored sconces multiplied the candlelight, velvet curtains swallowed the smoke, gilded trim flashed with every flame, making the air feel charmed, as if luck could be bought and debt could be prayed away. Dice clicked, cards whispered, coins slid across green bays with the soft confidence of money that belonged to someone else. Henry Harrow sat at the best table, as if the place had been opened for him. He wore mourning black cut well enough to pass for virtue, though his collar was loosened, and his hair had the faint careless disorder of a man who had been laughing too long. A signet ring flashed when he lifted his glass, the Harrow crest winking in the light like a threat disguised as jewelry. Two women leaned in close on either side, one draped in pearl-grey silk, the other in wine-red satin. Their laughter came easily, practiced and bright, as if the sound itself were part of the club's service. "You're cruel tonight," the woman in grey said, tapping his wrist with a fan. "Do you mean to ruin every gentleman here?" Henry's mouth curved, pleased with himself. "Only the ones who deserve it." "That's all of them," the woman in red purred, and took a sip from his glass without asking. Henry let her. He let most things happen around him, so long as they happened in a way that confirmed he was the center. Across the table, a thick-necked merchant stared at Henry's pile of coins like it had personally insulted him. The man's jaw worked, his knuckles tightened around the dice cup. Henry watched him with mild interest, as if the man were a dog deciding whether to bite. "Double," the merchant said. Henry didn't hesitate. "Triple." A quiet ripple went through the watchers. The house loved a nobleman who wagered like he could afford to lose. Better still if he wagered like losing would be someone else's problem. Behind Henry's right shoulder stood Giles, smooth as oiled leather, hands folded, eyes doing sums no one else could see. Giles had the look of a man born to be agreeable, which meant he was rarely honest. Behind Henry's left shoulder, a pace back in shadow, Lucian stood in a posture that never softened, the way men stood when they had learned young that a room could turn on you without warning. "Your lordship," Giles murmured, close enough that only Henry could hear. "Perhaps we might consider moderation." Henry didn't look at him. "Perhaps we might consider silence." Giles smiled like that was exactly what he'd hoped Henry would say. The dice rolled. They struck the table like a verdict. Henry won. The merchant went pale in the way of a man realizing he'd just gambled with the wrong devil. Henry scooped the coins without counting them and slid a portion toward the dealer with the casual generosity of a prince tossing scraps to keep the dogs loyal. The woman in red clapped, delighted. Again. Henry leaned back, basking, and let the room keep feeding him admiration. It was easier here. In London, he was Henry Harrow, heir, title, crest, promise. Not Henry Harrow, disappointing son, weighed in a father's gaze against the younger brother who could balance ledgers and charm men twice his age. His fingers toyed with his winnings. He set 6 coins in a neat line, not as a count, not as a tally, just a habit of order imposed on chaos. When the dealer reached for the next hand, Henry let 1 coin roll, slow, until it knocked the last out of line. A small clatter, lost under laughter. For a heartbeat, the sound was not a coin. It was a page tearing. It came back without permission. A nursery room that smelled of beeswax and sea wind trapped in old stone. A thick book with painted ships and a queen made of moonlight. A ribbon marking a place her mother loved. Adrian on a footstool, too earnest, too pleased with himself, singing a stanza with a voice not yet broken into manhood. Henry had laughed then, not because it was funny, because laughter made other boys look away. Again, her mother had said, warm and absent-minded, brushing Adrian's hair back like he was a favorite instrument. Adrian had grinned, and Henry had felt something sharp in his ribs that he didn't have a name for yet. Later, his father had called Henry clumsy, wasteful, soft in the head. Then, with the same mouth, he'd praised Adrian's numbers and said the ports needed a mind that could keep men honest. Henry had learned early that love could be counted. He had learned later how to change the numbers. The merchant didn't hear it. The women didn't notice it. Giles noticed, because Giles noticed what Henry did when he was pleased. Lucian noticed, because Lucian noticed what Henry did when he was thinking. Henry lifted his glass again and found in the crowd beyond the table a man watching him. Not staring, not gawking, watching. Plain brown coat, hair cut short, posture like a soldier, eyes like a clerk. The kind of man who could stand in a room all night and leave no memory behind except that someone's fortune had changed hands. The man looked away a moment later, as if he had never been looking at all. Henry felt a small pinch of annoyance. Then he dismissed it. London was full of men who wanted something. So was Henry. A new figure slid into the circle of light at the edge of his table, and the room made space without realizing it had done so. Lucian moved closer, not hurrying, not apologizing. He leaned down toward Henry's ear as if offering a compliment. "My lord," Lucian said softly, "you have company in Greymark." Henry didn't react at first, not outwardly. He had been trained from boyhood not to give the room any more truth than he meant to. He let the word sit, Greymark, like a taste he didn't want. Then he said lightly, "And Kevenack," he said, lightly, letting it sound bored, letting it sound like a name that meant nothing. Lucian's tone kept it courteous. 2 agents, cloaks wet from travel, a clerk with a ledger. They asked for the hall records, shipping entries, letters in and out. Henry took a sip and swallowed slowly, as if he had all the time to be inconvenienced. "And the packet?" he asked. Lucian paused, just long enough for the pause to do its work. "Sealed," he said, "with Harrow green." Henry's smile did not disappear. It simply stopped being real. For a heartbeat, the candlelight felt sharper, as if it had turned and chosen a side. "Harrow green," Henry repeated, tasting it like it might become less true. Lucian's mouth barely moved. "They asked about your brother." The women leaned closer again at the word brother, hungry for drama. Henry turned his head a fraction, not a glare, not anger, just a reminder that he was not their story to consume. Lucian went on, voice still soft. "Adrian is still with the pirate, still not returned." Henry's eyes flicked down to his 6 coins. He nudged one with a fingertip, sending it sliding back into line. "Kidnapped," Giles murmured, as if the word were a prayer he could sell later. Henry gave a quiet laugh, the kind men gave when a misfortune belonged to someone else.
If Adrian is with pirates, he will either learn to swim or learn to beg. Either way, he'll be different when he comes back. Lucian watched him, unreadable. And if he doesn't come back? Henry shrugged, elegant, unbothered. Then my father will mourn the son he loved, Henry said, and the cruelty of it was in how easily the sentence fit his mouth. He turned his attention back to the table, as if the world had merely offered him a dull piece of gossip. The dealer dealt. Cards slid out like little verdicts. The room held its breath in the pleasant, stupid way it did for money. Henry set his bet without looking at his hand. Lucian did not leave. Lady Vale is still there, in your father's hall, asking her questions, making her pauses. Henry smiled faintly. She can pause all she likes. London is patient. His thumb pressed absent against the face of his ring. The Harrow crest bit back. He didn't flinch. Somewhere far away, in a noble hall lit with colder lamps, a woman with sharp eyes and softer voice was opening doors with manners and closing them with law. And here, in the golden room built to make men forget consequence, Henry Harrow won another hand without once asking what it cost. Lucian straightened finally. "Do you want me to do anything?" Henry did not look up. He only tapped his 6 coins once and let the sound vanish into the music. "Let them look," Henry said. "Let them count." Then he smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes just enough to be convincing. "Everyone in this city thinks they understand who pulls a string. They never look at the hand that tied the knot." The great hall of Greymark was still holding the echo of Vale's visit. Servants moved as if the air could be fined. The Duke sat like a man who refused to be repositioned. Lady Sebastienne Vale did not hurry. She never did. Her agents carried the ledger, the clerk carried the ink, Vale carried nothing at all, which was its own kind of message. They had already made the room understand the shape of her authority. Now she used it. A side door opened for her without her asking. A corridor admitted her like it had been trained. In the private solar that smelled faintly of dried seaweed and old wood polish, a fire hissed low and resentful. Vale's agent shut the door. The sound was gentle. The meaning was not. "What else is kept here?" Vale said softly, not a question, more like a pressure applied. A man stood out of the corner shadow, not a servant, not quite a steward. He had the careful face of someone who had lived too long inside other people's homes. "My lady," he murmured, and did not look at her eyes. "The library has been catalogued." Vale turned her head slightly. Catalogued is a word men use when they mean hidden. His throat worked. "There is an old volume, a children's book, illustrated. It belonged to the late Duchess." That got her attention, not because she loved stories, but because she knew what men dismissed as stories. He placed the book on the table as if it were a small, harmless embarrassment. It was thick, heavy with gilt-edged pages and colored plates that had once been meant to make a child gasp. A sea painted too blue to be true, ships too proud to survive the channel, a woman's face rising out of moonlit water, beautiful in a way that suggested teeth. Vale ran her gloved fingers over the cover. "This the Duke keeps," she said. "He keeps what she touched," he answered, and the bitterness in it surprised him. He swallowed it quickly. He opened to the middle, where the binding creaked like a complaint. She did not flip pages like a sentimental. She flipped like an investigator, fast, precise, hunting for patterns. Most of the book was intact. Most of it was nonsense in the way all old folklore is nonsense. Too many warnings, too many moral lessons dressed as monsters. Then she found the damage.
a ragged edge where a page had been torn out, not cleanly removed, not respectfully cut, torn. Beside it, another, and another. Vale's eyes narrowed. She turned back to the nearest surviving leaf and found half a stanza printed beneath a painted crescent moon, only half because the rest had vanished with the torn page. The remaining lines were innocent at first glance, the kind of sing-song verse a mother might hum while braiding hair. Vale read them once, then again, slower. When the tide holds its breath and the bright mouth sings, watch the moon's eye, watch the waters ring. The words should have felt childish. They did not. There was a smear at the margin where a finger had traced them too often. There was a faint score where something had once been folded out, a map or plate removed entirely, leaving only the ghost of stitches. Vale closed the book halfway and let the cover fall shut with a soft thud. A half page about a song, a thick book with only one section mutilated. That was never an accident. Who did this? Vale asked. He hesitated. That was answer enough. A child, he said finally. Vale's smile was gentle and almost kind. Children become men, she said. Men become liabilities. She opened the book again, this time to the torn seam, and pressed her thumb to the fibers. They were old, softened by time. The violence had been committed long before her arrival, long before the Crown had started reaching for control with warrants and ledgers and rope, but it had been committed by someone who understood that the missing part mattered. Vale looked up. Find me every hand that has held this book, every name, every punishment, every indulgence. I don't care if it was a nursery prank or a sin. Yes, my lady. And, Vale added, almost as an afterthought, send word to the clerk, ask him what the Harrow boy loved as a child.
The man blinked. My lady? Vale's eyes stayed on the half-stanza. A man's habits begin in his cradle, so do his secrets. The fire hissed again, the house creaked in the wind. Somewhere below, the sea struck the cliffs like a warning that never learned to get tired. Vale shut the book and slid it into a leather wrap like it was evidence, or bait. Fog still clung to the sea, pressing against the hull as if it meant to board. Corvin's cabin was lit for a meal that no one had appetite for. A single lantern hung above the captain's dinner table, throwing warm light over plain ship fare and a bottle that had not been opened. The table itself was wide and scarred, made for charts and arguments more than comfort. A map lay rolled at one end beside a knife and a smear of wax from an earlier seal. The stern window leaked a thin band of moonlight across the floor, turning the room into two halves, gold and pale. Corvin Vane sat at the head of the table without eating. One hand rested near his cup, the other lay open on the wood, still, as if it had learned patience the hard way. Adrian Harrow sat on Corvin's right, not bound, not free. He could feel the parole in the space between the chair legs and the door, in the way the pistol hooks on the wall were not decoration, in the way Corvin's attention moved when the ship creaked, as if the whole world was something that might try the latch. Adrian kept his hands visible on the table, a habit from court, a survival from everywhere else. Footsteps stopped outside the door, a knock careful. Captain. Corvin didn't look up. Enter. The quartermaster stepped in, cap in hand. His shoulders were tight with urgency that refused to become panic. His eyes flicked to Adrian for the briefest moment, then back to Corvin. News from Greymark, the quartermaster said. Corvin's voice stayed level. Speak. Royal agents enters Harrow's hall, two of them, wet cloaks, a clerk with a ledger hugged like a shield. They brought a sealed packet, Harrow green. Adrian didn't move, but his focus sharpened, quick and cold. And Lady Sebastienne Vale is there, in the Duke's face, talking like she owns the room. Corvin's fingers tightened around the rim of his cup. The tin gave a small complaint. "She made it," Corvin said. Adrian's answer was quiet. "She always does." The quartermaster swallowed and delivered the second cut. "They're moving your men, the 6, at first light. Transfer order, 2 escorts. The clerk carries the originals." For a moment the cabin seemed to listen with them. The ship creaked. Somewhere above, rigging chimed softly, as if time was counting down. Corvin's gaze slid to the map on the table. Route. "Road towards the inner holdings," the quartermaster said quickly. "Daylight. Witnesses. They'll want it seen." Corvin nodded once. "Go." The quartermaster hesitated, then added lower, as if reluctant to repeat gossip. "One more thing," he said. "Her men weren't just sniffing ledgers." Corvin's eyes lifted. "Meaning?" "They were asking after an old book, a children's thing from the house. Pictures, sea stories. They didn't say why." Adrian's fingers, flat on the table, went very still.
The quartermaster noticed and pretended he hadn't. Corvin did not pretend. "Go," Corvin said, not unkindly, but final. "Wake the hands I name, quietly, no talk on deck." "Aye, Captain." The quartermaster left, the door shut with muted certainty. For a moment only the ship spoke, wood flexing, fog pressing, the distant hush of waves. Corvin watched Adrian as if he were reading a pie chart in a man's face. "You were too calm," Corvin said. "Tell me what Vale is doing in your father's hall." Adrian's gaze dropped to the wax smear beside the knife, to paper and steel sitting side by side like honest siblings. "She's writing the ending first," Adrian said. Corvin's eyes narrowed. "And the beginning." Adrian exhaled once, precise. "The crown is cornered," he said quietly, "short of coin and shorter of patience. His Majesty has squeezed money without Parliament and made enemies doing it. Scotland's defiance proved the realm can bleed, so now he reaches for control the way desperate men do. With hands," Corvin said. "With warrants, ledgers, seizures, authority that doesn't ask permission from the room." Corvin's jaw tightened once. "So she takes what she can carry and calls it proof." "Yes. And she makes sure people watch her carry it." Corvin leaned forward a fraction. "My men?" "Daylight transfers look clean. Clean paper, clean witnesses, clean ropes." Corvin's gaze stayed on Adrian. "And the book." Adrian's throat worked once. He kept his face steady. Corvin didn't let it slip away. "What book?" "It's old," Adrian said. "Illustrated. The sort a house keeps because a woman loved it, and men don't throw away what a dead woman touched." Corvin's eyes sharpened at that, but he didn't take the opening, not yet. "What is it about, and why does Vale want it badly enough to confront a duke?" Adrian answered like it was only ink. "Creatures of the sea, kraken, leviathan, scylla, mermaids, the whole tavern menagerie." Corvin didn't blink. "And sirens?" Adrian's eyes lifted. That small look gave the game away. "Yes," Adrian said. "Sirens." Corvin's voice stayed flat. "That's sailor talk." "It's all sailor talk. That's the disguise. No one fears a children's story." Corvin's gaze didn't move. "Vale does." Adrian hesitated, then chose the safest truth. "The siren pages are different, too patterned, too careful. There's a stanza that reads like a song, but sits in the book like a key, and some pages are missing." Corvin's attention sharpened to a point. "Missing how?" "A fold-out, a star map, parts of the verse, notes in the margins. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to suggest there's something meant to be done, not just read." Corvin absorbed that, like a man weighing powder. "So," he said softly, "Vale isn't hunting a story. She's hunting the person who can finish it." Adrian met his eyes. The lantern made both their shadows long across the table. For a moment, it felt like the cabin had narrowed, as if the ship itself leaned in to listen. Corvin pushed his plate aside. First light means we move before dawn. Adrian nodded once, already there. 2 prongs. Say them. Prong 1, we take the clerk and the originals. Quiet. Alive. Corvin's voice stayed flat. Alive. Yes, Adrian said. Dead men can't contradict her. Vale will make silence confess. Adrian lifted a second finger. Prong 2, we make their paper fight itself, he said. A counter-order, a reroute, something that makes obedient men freeze because they can't be certain whose wrath will reach them first. Corvin's stare narrowed. Forgery. Survival, Adrian said, and this time the word didn't apologize. Corvin leaned forward slightly. Can you write it? Yes. Then write it. Adrian reached for the quill. The words came too easily, authority shaped by cadence and threat wrapped in politeness. He hated that he could do it. He hated that Corvin watched him like it was the most honest thing Adrian had done all night. When Adrian finished, he slid the paper across. Corvin read it once, twice. Then he looked up, and something behind his eyes had settled into place. You just moved my men. Adrian's mouth curved faintly. I moved the obedient men holding them. Corvin held his gaze. You're proud. I'm welcome, Adrian said. Corvin exhaled, almost a laugh. There he is. Outside, the ship shifted. Fog pressed close. Dawn sharpened somewhere beyond it. Corvin stood, pushed his chair back, and went to the pistol hooks. He took one down and checked it with practiced calm. Then he looked at Adrian. You're not leaving this cabin tonight. Adrian's brows lifted. In your cabin. In my cabin.
Adrian's spine stiffened out of instinct. Is this strategy, he asked carefully, or are you indulging rumor? Security. From whom? Corvin didn't answer at once. The hesitation was its own answer. Then, quieter, from anyone who thinks you're entertainment, and from anyone who thinks they can use you without asking me first. Adrian swallowed. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more dangerous. Relief. Corvin nodded towards the narrow bunk. Sleep. Adrian stared at it like it might bite. And you? Adrian asked. Corvin moved to the chair by the door and sat with the pistol across his knee like it belonged there. I'll be here, he said. Adrian lay down anyway, boots off, breath shallow, mind still running. The blanket smelled of salt, smoke and worn leather. Not clean, not noble, real. Corvin turned the lantern down until the cabin held softer gold. Moonlight slid through the stern window in a pale band that cut the floor like a blade of chalk. Silence gathered, not empty, guarded. Adrian's voice came after a long moment, low, reluctant, as if he'd tried to swallow it and failed. It was my mother's, he said. Corvin didn't move. He didn't cress. He kept his gaze on the door, listening to the ship with one part of his mind and to Adrian with the other. I guessed, Corvin said. She read it to me, Adrian said, when I was small.
A pause. There's a stanza, Adrian added, and the words softened in his mouth without his permission. A song. She used to hum it when storms came, like the sea was a creature you could calm if you spoke to it properly. Corvin's voice stayed even. And you remember it? Adrian gave a quiet, humorless breath. I remember most things. It was meant to sound dismissive. It didn't. Corvin waited. He didn't pry. He held the silence like a shield, letting Adrian decide what could be placed on the table without becoming a weapon. Adrian's eyes stayed on the ceiling. My brother tore pages, he said, at last. Corvin's jaw tightened once. Henry. Yes. Why? Adrian's fingers curled once into the blanket and went still again, control returning. Because he saw me with it, reciting it, singing it, like a fool. Corvin's voice lowered. He called it weakness. He called it girlish. He said I sounded like a girl, moved like one, said our mother indulged me because she liked pretending she had a soft son. Corvin's silence turned heavier, not with judgment, but with contained anger. Adrian swallowed. He thought she loved me more, he said, and he hated that the Duke trusted me with work and not him. Corvin's eyes didn't leave Adrian's face. So he punished you where it mattered. Adrian's breath hitched, quick, then steadied. He tore what she loved, Adrian said. The fold-out, the margins, the verse. He did it slowly, so I'd remember every sound. The fog outside pressed closer, as if it liked the taste of confession. Corvin spoke into the quiet, and his voice was careful in a way Adrian didn't expect. You don't have to give me more tonight, not if it costs you. Adrian's eyes opened, surprised. Corvin didn't look away. But understand this, he added. If Vale has your book, and your book is missing what matters, she'll come for the part she can't tear out. Adrian didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth sat in his chest like a second heart. Corvin shifted in the chair by the door, not closer, not away, just enough to make the room feel held. A long silence passed. Then Corvin's voice came, low, almost reluctant, as if saying it aloud was riskier than a pistol. You're a beautiful man, Harrow. Adrian went still. In any other mouth it would have been a trap, a way to make him smaller. Here, it landed like a fact placed carefully on the table between them. Don't say things that can be repeated, Adrian murmured. Afraid of me? Of the story, not the man. Corvin didn't shift. Then it stays in this room. Pardon me, I always say what I have in mind. Adrian's throat tightened, not with fear, with the strange, dangerous shock of being spoken to without cruelty. No one speaks to me like I'm... Adrian stopped, the rest caught behind his teeth. Corvin's answer was quiet. Then they've been fools. Adrian closed his eyes again, pulse taking longer than it should to settle. Outside, the sea kept time. First light waited. And somewhere on the coast, a woman held a thick old book she did not yet fully understand, while a man with a stolen face carried the other half of the puzzle like a private joke. Between them stood one living missing page, and the fog pressed closer, as if it meant to board.